Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello friends, it is festival season, and this summer I'll be speaking and hosting live shows on stages and in tents across both the UK and USA. On Friday the 25th of July, I'll be co-hosting a live re-enchanting conversation at the Wildfires Festival on the Western Estate. Sunday the 27th of July, I'm hot-footing it over to South Dakota, USA, to speak on the surprising rebirth of belief in God at Embrace Church in Sioux Falls. Thursday the 31st of July to Friday the 1st of August, I'm back in the UK, this time speaking at the New Wine Festival in Somerset. And then from the 22nd to 24th of August, I'll be co-hosting a podcast tent at the Big Church Festival in Sussex, joined by some amazing guests across 3 days. And there's lots more coming up this autumn too, including our Responding to the Rebirth conference in London on the 22nd of November. But I hope I may see you at some of these events over the summer. To keep up to date with live shows and speaking events, subscribe to my newsletter. The link is with the podcast. Enjoy today's show.
You've presumably talked to Neil Ferguson and his lovely wife,
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
I was invited to go to tea with them a few weeks ago. The whole family were baptized. And Neil said what had made him open his eyes was seeing his wife being, as he said, raised from the dead. I mean, I've known that in my own family, in my own lifetime. This stuff does happen.
Often people feel like, well, it isn't happening here, though. Is there something about the Western mind and philosophy and the sort of disenchanted scientific age that we've essentially embraced?
The very word supernatural gets it wrong, collapses into some form of Platonism. The other world, the supernatural world, is the real one, but sooner or later you're going to have to kiss goodbye to Plato if you want the full-on biblical Christianity.
Probably time to talk about Acts 17. For that one chapter alone, chapter 7 in your book, this book is easily worth the price on the cover.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And speaking sort of as an apologist who's preached a few times on Acts 17, you kind of took me down a peg or two myself as well in that chapter.
Sorry, not intentional. It's just how it goes. That's what happens when you start doing history.
Hello and welcome back to the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast. I'm Justin Brierley and I'm delighted to be bringing you a conversation with N.T. Wright today, or Tom Wright as he's also known. Easily one of the most significant theological influences in my life, and someone I had the privilege of hosting a regular podcast with for almost 5 years. We caught up recently to talk about his latest book, The Challenge of Acts, and what the New Testament account of the birth of the church in the first century has to say to my thesis that we're seeing a rebirth in the 21st century. Well, just before we dive in, a reminder that you can keep up to date with the show by subscribing to my newsletter. I'll even send you the first chapter of both my Surprising Rebirth book and my new book, Why I'm Still a Christian, when you do so. And if you'd like to support this podcast, it does make a huge difference in me being able to record and broadcast shows like this one. Monthly silver supporters get early access to new episodes plus bonus content, and gold supporters also get a monthly catch-up call with me and signed copies of both my books. And exclusive to supporters this month, we're releasing my full conversation with biblical scholar Nijay Gupta, his excellent book, Strange Religion, How the First Christians Were Weird, Dangerous and Compelling. Really great book. And you can get that full conversation between myself and Nijay when you support. That's bonus content this month for supporters. The link then for the newsletter and to support is with the show notes. So let's jump into episode 17 of season 2 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. N.T. Wright on Acts, miracles, and the rebirth of the church today.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
Welcome along to today's show. Tom Wright is Senior Research Fellow at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University. He's the former Bishop of Durham and, of course, a prolific author. His most recent book is The Challenge of Acts. And we'll be talking today about how the rise of the early church under the Roman Empire, often through miracles, signs and wonders, speaks to our post-Christian West and its own modern search for meaning. We'll be taking a deep dive as well into Paul's famous standoff with the philosophers and thinkers at Athens in Acts 17. What does his famous speech on Mars Hill have to say to a church that also seeks to speak to a world that is often hostile to Christian faith? Tom, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Good to be with you again.
It's lovely to catch up again. We've done a number of things over the years, and I always love finding out what the latest thing is that you've written and been thinking about. Acts is obviously a rip-roaring sort of a adventure book right there in the middle of the New Testament. Quite fun to write on, I can imagine.
It is. And the last time I wrote on Acts, which was for Acts for Everyone in my little Everyone series, that I must have done that about, 15, 17 years ago. And I remember it went quite quickly, but I wrote up a storm. I went and hid away in a little cottage and simply wrote and wrote and wrote. And it was enormous fun. Every time you turn the page, there's, oh my goodness, it's this story and then that story and so on. But doing it at speed gave me that sense of the overview, the whole thing, which when I then did the material which has become this book, The Challenge of Acts, I've done it like that in 4-chapter chunks. So that to change the metaphor, it's like going up to 35,000 feet and surveying the landscape and saying, oh my goodness, there's a whole thing going on there. And then this all joins up there in a way which, when you're doing the detailed on-the-ground stuff, you don't always see those bigger patterns. So that's been great fun.
Yes, I've really enjoyed that because I've read the For Everyone series version, and this is quite different. You're not just getting a rehash here. It's very much, as you say, taking the big themes and you don't necessarily get a point by point detail of what's going on in Acts, but you get a great overview of how it connects with so much of what's going on then and in today's world, obviously. I mean, what do you think about this idea that we are in a somewhat Acts situation in the modern post-Christian West? You could say, well, we are a small church, arguably. We are facing various empires around us. And I've even heard some people refer to us no longer as even a post-Christian culture, but as a pre-Christian culture, because the memory of Christianity is so far in the back mirror for so many people. I don't know whether that's really an accurate characterization, though. What's your thoughts on that, Tom?
I'm not sure that there is any one size fits all for this, because, apart from who are we here? Is it we in the UK? In which case, which we are we talking about? Are we talking about the very lively, bouncy house churches, the Alpha group, the Alpha movement, which I meet with some of those leaders from time to time, and they don't feel like a post-Christian or a pre-Christian church. They just feel like a very energetic, full-on Christian church. Then when you go to America, there are all sorts of varieties there. You go to Europe, there are all sorts of varieties there, but also places which make us look positively, deeply religious. There's some parts of France where it just seems to have died out, though that's not my field. I'm not an expert. So I'm not sure that it's this easy to generalize. The other thing is, of course, Acts is totally unlike us in that we still have a church on every street corner, metaphorically speaking. Certainly here in Oxford, you can't walk more than a few hundred yards without seeing some sort of building which has connections with the Christian church, either a college chapel or somewhere like Pusey House or whatever. And so even if a lot of people pass by without giving it a thought, there's actually an awful lot of people still in our culture for whom this is a very important part of life. So obviously in Acts, as I've often said to people, when Paul comes into, Thessalonica or somewhere like that, and says, the world has a new Lord, and people look at him a bit strangely because Caesar is Lord, we know that, and say, well, the world has a new Lord, and he's a Jewish man, yeah, and he's a Jewish man called Jesus, oh, and he was crucified. And at this point they're saying, what on earth is this about? And then he says, but God raised him from the dead. And now they are rolling their eyes and wondering what Paul has been smoking. And you know, it's so it's impossible to imagine, except in the sort of wilds of some jungle somewhere, meeting people who were so far out of touch that this was simply not on their radar at all. For us, it would be, oh yeah, you're one of those Christian types. Well, we gave them up long ago. Or, yes, we vaguely know about this, but of course, my grandma took us to church and we haven't been ever since. Those are the sort of reactions you get, which are totally unlike, of course, anything that you'd find in the Book of Acts. I think if you want the Acts situation, you have to go to certain parts of the what we used to call the third world or the two-thirds world, where there is real frontier stuff. I remember the late, great Michael Green saying to me, if you go to the Philippines, you find you're in the Acts of the Apostles. They're right at the cutting edge, and they're doing all the stuff about healings and exorcisms and so on. For Michael Green, this was terrific. This was sort of real bouncy early church stuff. I've not been to the Philippines myself, so I can't speak to that. But so I think the attempt to map Acts onto us in any way has got to be done much more subtly. We've got to think Acts in its first century context and then say, okay, now, what's going on? What are the big patterns? And how do they then play out in our world, which requires much more than a simple lifting up from one side and putting down the other. That's true of all hermeneutics, but I think we see it particularly with Acts.
I mean, we will come, as I said, to Acts 17, where I think there's potentially it speaks the most obviously to our post-Christian world. But sticking with sort of miracles, signs and wonders, I like you know, you do hear of so many interesting things happening in parts that are not the Western world. I think of Iran, where apparently, you know, the church, that's the part of the world where the church is growing the fastest, and the many sort of signs and wonders stories emerging from that place. I know that in China, where there's been obviously a hugely fast-growing Christian church, I think there was a statistic that over 3/4 of people who convert say that some kind of miracle was involved in their conversion, which is quite extraordinary. And so in that sense, you know, that sort of thing is happening, evidently. Often people feel like, well, it isn't happening here, though. And I wonder, is there something about the Western mind and philosophy and the sort of disenchanted scientific age that we've essentially embraced that sort of dampens that work in the West that we see, you know, happening so naturally in things like the Book of Acts?
I think we easily miss things in our culture, including those of us who are lifelong Christians. I was thinking of this just recently, and I'm struggling now to remember what the particular thing was, but I hear reasonably frequently about people who the doctors had given up on being prayed for and getting better, in various ways. And it's always a mystery, like it was in the early church, that sometimes you pray for somebody and they die anyway. Sometimes you pray and amazingly they turn the corner and they get better again. And I've known that in my own family, in my own lifetime, extraordinary things where the doctors are still scratching their heads saying, I've no idea why this person is alive. They should have died 10 years ago, but they seem to be perfectly healthy now. This stuff does happen. It's just we don't make a big song and dance about it in the way that some cultures have done. And I'm always a bit wary of making, whether you call it signs and wonders or whatever, one of the big things, because that can easily play into what I think is our real problem, which is an awful lot of Western culture is still basically deism, and as somebody, I forget who it was, said, moral therapeutic deism. In other words, we believe in this distant God who kind of wants us to behave, and if we trust him, he will make us feel a bit better about ourselves or something. That is certainly how an awful lot of sort of half Christians or people on the edge of the faith see things. And then the signs and wonders sort of come in, oh boy, God actually does stuff. Isn't that amazing? And I think most wise Christians and pastors across different contemporary cultures would say, actually, yeah, we've been praying for this person and this has happened. We've been praying for this situation and this has happened, and so on and so on. This is the norm. And if we imagine that signs and wonders are this distant God suddenly stepping in and doing something, then I think that's an own goal theologically. The God who made the world is always living and active within the world. Paul says that in Acts 17. And so if sometimes what he does is surprising and startling, we shouldn't be surprised and startled because he is God after all, and he's around all the time. So I resist the sort of either or of, oh, there are signs and wonders there, but then there aren't here. So I wonder how they're being interpreted and really what's going on in the larger implicit philosophical or theological culture.
I think there is, though, something about the willingness for the average Western person to accept what perhaps someone else would naturally see as the work of God happening in and around them. I mean, the person who comes to mind, interestingly, and who you do mention briefly in the book, is Tom Holland, the historian. Now, I had this last year a really interesting conversation with Tom, a public conversation in London, where he obviously talked about his well-known thesis now in Dominion, the way in which the Christian Revolution has essentially shaped the moral instincts of the West in so many ways. But he also talked quite candidly about some particular instances in his own life where he seems to have experienced something verging on the miraculous, in particular, a sort of an answered prayer for bowel cancer that was sort of uttered almost as a desperate agnostic's prayer on Christmas Eve a couple of years ago. And then a range of really interesting, unusual circumstances happened that led to the all clear. And he said, of all the things that have happened, that's really the thing that's brought him to the edge of belief. And he has this phrase, which I've picked up on quite a bit as well in my own book and podcast series, that it's important to keep Christianity weird, to not downplay the miraculous, because that's essentially, in his view, its great selling point at this point, because in a sense, the morals of Christianity have become so completely accepted, they've become almost invisible to view in modern culture. And his advice is, maybe go back to preaching the really weird stuff today about miracles and angels and resurrection and that sort of thing. What's your take on all of that, Tom?
I mean, you can't have genuine Christianity without the resurrection. Let's be quite clear about that. And you've presumably talked to Neil Ferguson and his lovely wife.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I haven't yet at the time of recording, but I hope to very soon.
Okay. I was invited to go to tea with them a few weeks ago because their parish priest in the little village outside Oxford where they live used to be my brother-in-law's curate about 20 years ago, and I knew him from then. And they, the whole family, were baptized a few weeks ago, extraordinarily. And Neil said what had made him open his eyes was seeing his wife go through a very difficult period and then being, as he said, raised from the dead. I mean, he said it was just like new life, and it made him think, oh my goodness, something is going on here, which I don't have any other explanation for. And there was a real humility about that. And you probably shouldn't quote me quoting him. You should get the quote from him himself. But that was the same kind of thing. So yes, whether you say it's the weird stuff or whatever, that's, if by that you mean that Christianity is about the overlap and interplay of heaven and earth, and that when heaven and earth come together, it's both dangerous and exciting and strange things happen, well, yes, absolutely. So if that's weird, if somebody lives in one of those little modernist boxes which has denied all that, well, good luck to them. Wake up and smell the coffee, because there is all sorts of stuff out there. As a pastor, and indeed in, quote, ordinary life, unquote, again and again, whether in the corner of a pub or in a work shed in the middle of a shift, if somebody says, a funny thing happened to my aunt the other day, she said she'd gone to church and da-da-da-da. There are certain moments when actually everybody in the room has a similar story, and they don't normally talk about it because it is weird and they don't want to be thought weird. But if somebody opens the possibility that maybe we should share these things, it's remarkable what comes out. So I think a lot of people are kind of ready for it. maybe skeptical if people get too jumpy and overexcited and claim that their world has all totally changed, because people who know them might well say, well, let's just wait and see how this works out, shall we? But many people do have that sense, and
I get the sense, as you do, that it's always been there. It's just that I think something has slightly changed in our culture. You know, this is my big thesis, that with the waning of that very sort of materialist insistence of the new atheists, people just feel a bit more free. People like Tom Holland to talk about things that they might have once been ridiculed for, talking on a public stage. And you know, likewise with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you know, one of the supreme rationalists of the last 10 or 20 years, now suddenly, you know, this extraordinary change. And I think it's just opened her eyes to the possibility of the miraculous. And I suppose the side of this is that I think there is this sort of re-enchantment sort of gradually percolating up in culture, but it can go in different directions. You know, there's also an interest in the occult, you know, Ouija boards. There's more of a demand for exorcism now than there ever has been, ironically. So I suppose it can go in different directions, can't it, Tom?
Yes, it can. But I mean, the idea of re-enchantment, of course, I have lived, I know, in a sheltered world of cathedrals and abbeys and dioceses and churches and so on. So in a sense, I have never shared that disenchantment. I've always lived in what now one might call an enchanted world. I would say it's God's world, the world in which heaven and earth overlap. But I know, I mean, there are moments like, I may have told you this long before, one time when we were living in Durham, my daughter brought some of her friends from the city to come and stay for a weekend, and they were all very secular girls. And my daughter said, "Now, Dad, please, let's not have any Christian talk over the weekend, because that's not where my friends are." Anyway, on the Saturday, it poured with rain, and they said, "What are we going to do?" "Oh, let's go to Durham Cathedral. We've never been there before." And they went into Durham Cathedral as the choir were practicing for evensong, and one of these quite hard-boiled, sort of late 20s, early 30s city girls suddenly found herself in floods of tears and had no idea why. And they came back home and sat around the table. "Dad, what was that? What was going on? What was that all about?" And suddenly, having been very firmly told we're not talking about faith and spirituality, that's all they wanted to talk about, because something happened and she didn't know why. So, I mean, that stuff is going on a lot. And I've often said, you know, okay, I live in Oxford. Again, it's a rather unusual place. But if you took all the people who are in church or a college chapel on a Sunday in Oxford, and you shut up all the buildings except one enormous one, you would find 15 or 20,000 people in that building, all of whom in some way or other want to be worshipping the God who is revealed in Jesus. Okay, there'd be a lot of muddle, there would be a lot of different musical styles, whatever, but there's a lot of us out there. And you know, Richard Dawkins sitting up in North Oxford scowling at us, well, good luck to him. But actually, it hasn't happened the way people thought it would with the secularization thesis.
You mentioned Richard Dawkins, and I'm going to bring this back to your book on Acts in a moment, but he famously, sort of a clip of him went viral over the last year, of him claiming that he was in fact a cultural Christian, despite his frequent sort of, you know, disparaging of religion. And that's interesting, because again, this is part of the interesting move that I've seen happening, not just the intellectuals who seem to be fully embracing Christianity, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, but even some who still are hard, you know, atheists, but who are at least opening up to the value of Christianity. And it would have been surprising, frankly, to hear Richard Dawkins saying even nice things about cathedrals and carols, you know, at the height of the God delusion and so on. So what do you make of that? Is there any value in that? I suppose your book on Acts made me think of it, because you do have words to say about those who want to sort of hold on to Christian values without believing in the resurrection, essentially. The people who want the good stuff without this supernatural stuff, as it were. So any thoughts on that?
Well, again, and you and I must have talked about this before, the very word supernatural gets it wrong. That implies, and you see, C.S. Lewis, one of my great heroes, at the beginning of his book Miracles, he basically lines up naturalism and supernaturalism. Now, actually what he's talking about is Epicureanism and Platonism. And the danger with talking about supernaturalism is that it collapses into some form of Platonism, where the other world, the supernatural world, is the real one, and this world of space, time and matter and, log tables and slide rules or whatever it is just trivial and ultimately going to wither away. And that's simply not what the Bible teaches. So I'm very wary of the whole idea of the supernatural. And I know that's the term in which the debate has often been conducted, but I think that is basically playing on the opponent's ground, not on the Epicurean or atheist opponent's ground, but on the Platonist's ground, which I see as in its way even more insidious and dangerous. So I really want to shift the terms of that debate. Having said that, of course, Plato can be a way in, just as all sorts of things can be a way in. But sooner or later, you're going to have to kiss goodbye to Plato if you want the full-on biblical Christianity. Now, it's taken me half a lifetime to make that move intellectually and culturally, and I'm still, in a sense, working out what that means. Watch this space, because God willing, there's a book coming out in about 15 months from now called God's Homecoming.
Don't say. Another book, Tom. Who would have thought it?
Yeah, I know. I look at the books on the shelf and I'm how did they all happen? I simply don't know. But so that I want to celebrate and be glad at all that you're saying, but in terms of whether we call it enchantment or whatever, an awful lot of us have been doing this stuff for a long time, and if other people are suddenly realizing there's something going on here, well, good, okay, but now let's please make sure that we're thinking wisely about it and not allowing rather unhelpful categories to frame the discourse which then emerges. Whether it's, and the word miracles, I just don't like that word, because it suggests this distant God who occasionally intervenes, rather than the creator God who is always present and always active and sometimes does things that we really didn't expect. And in the middle of that, the resurrection, if you take away resurrection, you don't have Christianity, despite what some liberal theologians have said. That Paul said, if the Messiah is not raised, our faith is futile and you're still in your sins. It just doesn't make sense without it. So that's in a whole separate category. And the danger is then saying, oh, well, miracles, things like virgin birth, resurrection, whatever. No, excuse me, resurrection is the coping stone which holds the whole arch together. Is that a coping stone? You know what I mean, the stone at the top of the arch.
Friends, I'm delighted to announce that tickets for our Responding to the Rebirth conference are now on sale at rebirthconference.net. If you've been tracking the surprising rebirth of belief in God, or the news of a quiet revival in the UK, you won't want to miss this day in London on Saturday, the 22nd of November, 2025. I'll be joined by guests including Professor John Lennox, author Paul Kingsnorth, podcaster Elizabeth Oldfield, Bishop Mike Royal, researcher Rhiannon McAleer, and the Reverend Al Gordon, as we explore what's happening, why, and what next steps we can take as a new generation returns to faith. I'm so looking forward to co-hosting the day with Glenn Scrivener of Speak Life as we encourage the church to be ready for this turning of the tide. Tickets are going surprisingly fast, so book your seat now at rebirthconference.net.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
So the thing that I really gave me hope really in this book, The Challenge of Acts, was that you obviously take us through all the extraordinary things that are going on, the miracles and the deliverances and you know,
miracles. You said
but
again.
Well, sorry, I know. Slap on the wrist. It's my brain still works in terms of supernatural and miracles. But anyway, the point being that you settle this obviously within the context of Acts, which is lots of interesting detail as well about the political and religious debates going on at the time that Paul and Luke, who's recounting this, sort of are in the middle of themselves. And you know, you're able to see that it was really messy as well. There was lots of, you know, false starts, disagreements, fallings out. And I suppose the reason that gave me hope is that we find ourselves in just the same position today. Political entanglements, disagreements. And yet somehow my hope and prayer is that God is still working in his own way through it all, despite our own fallenness. I suppose to some extent that comes to something of a head when Paul visits Athens, and it's probably time to talk about Acts 17. Because I have to say, for that one chapter alone, chapter 7 in your book, this book is easily worth the price on the cover.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Such a one. I've never read anything quite like it in terms of your exposition of Paul's speech on the Areopagus. The first thing that slightly blew my mind was it dismantled my idea that he had essentially been invited there by the thinkers to sort of present his case to a sort of, you know, these intellectuals who want to hear the latest thing. Now, to be fair, I think when you read Luke's account, it does sound a bit like that. But you say actually something else is going on when Paul is invited.
I mean, the Areopagus was not a philosophical debating society. They debated stuff all over the place in the Forum and elsewhere. Some people actually think that the Areopagus speech was delivered in the Forum, not on the Mars Hill itself. Be that as it may, the point is the Areopagus is the highest court in the land. It's like being summoned to the Supreme Court. You know, this is, we're not even bothering about the lower level magistrates. This is come up in front of the big judges. And the Areopagus, according to legend and myth, founded by Apollo and Athene themselves way back when, in order to try Orestes, who was, you know, one great mythical figure who'd murdered his mother in revenge for her killing his father, and though Apollo had told him to do it, he was still guilty, and the Furies are after him, etc. So all of that's going on. But the point is, Paul is on trial. The Greek phrase which is used for him being brought up to the Areopagus is not no, let's have a glass of sherry and go into the seminar. It's you're coming with us and you're coming to face the music. And when they say, are we allowed to know what it is you're talking about? Again, that phrase is, are you peddling some secret mystery which might disturb our status quo? And particularly the charge, we think you're preaching foreign divinities, which everyone who knew their Socrates story, which most of them did, would recognize that's what Socrates was accused of. And he ended up drinking the hemlock. Now, okay, he was corrupting the young as well. Now, no doubt they think that Paul is doing that too, though they don't say it. But then it makes so much sense of the speech which Paul is reported as having given, that he isn't simply saying, here are some signs in your culture of the fact that there might be a God who ... Actually, the speech doesn't quite work like that anyway. But, okay, you're accusing me of preaching foreign divinities, so how come you've got an altar to this unknown God right in your midst? He's not foreign. He's right here. It's just you don't know who he is. And then all the stuff about God as creator, again, it's answering that charge of foreign divinity. You know, they don't want foreign divinities because we've already got Athene. She looks after us. Some foreign divinity will come in, and the next thing we know, Athene will be knocked off her perch, and then we're all in trouble. And that's how civic society works. You keep the local gods happy, thank you very much, and don't have other people invading. Same thing, actually, mutatis mutandis in Ephesus with Artemis and the Temple of Artemis there a couple of chapters later. So it's a defense, a legal defense, but in the course of the legal defense, as happens in one or two other scenes in Acts, the tables are turned. Paul starts off being the defendant in a trial, but he ends up saying, there is a God who you've not really understood before, and he's fixed a day on which he will judge the whole world. In other words, you in Athens think you've got this greatest court in all the world. Let me tell you there's an even greater one. And the proof of it is Jesus was raised from the dead, which has the irony that in the mythical founding of the Areopagus, then Apollo says, when a man dies and his blood is spilt on the ground, there is no resurrection. So the Areopagus is founded because if you make the wrong legal decision and kill somebody, or death penalty, you can't bring them back again. And so no resurrection, therefore you need a good court. And Paul says, actually, resurrection, therefore there is an even higher court. Now, this ought actually to be, I think, pretty straightforward as reading the text, but I know that isn't how most people have read this text down the years. And what you got in chapter 7, did you say it was, of my book, actually incorporates, and I think I may have said this, a lecture I gave in Harvard a couple of years ago, where the group that had invited me said, we're under increasing pressure on campus by people who say that Christianity is dangerous and ought not to be allowed, and we ought to be banning you, and because we don't feel safe if you're saying your thing. And so there was a sense there, as there is in some parts of British culture as well, that Christianity is no longer acceptable. It's no longer the case that everyone agrees with Christian morals. They don't. It's quite clear. So in a sense, if we need to make a defense against the charge of the postmodern woke world, whatever it is, or indeed the ultra-modern far-right world of certain people who should be nameless, then where do we start? We start with this story about the Creator God who actually is around the place and wants to get to know us, and this story as the Judean story of a God who made the world and will hold it to account, and will do so through the Jesus whom he raised from the dead. So I see this both as exciting historically to understand what was going on, and as very relevant in our own day, but not in the way that an older style of apologetics would have imagined. I hope that makes sense.
Indeed. And speaking sort of as an apologist who's preached a few times on Acts 17, you kind of took me down a peg or two myself as well in that chapter.
Sorry, not intentional. It's just how it goes. That's what happens when you start doing history.
I very much, enjoyed those, takes on Acts 17 and Paul's speech, that it's all about him finding common ground with the Athenians and reaching into their culture to sort of show that, we're on a level playing field, and here's how I'm going to build my case for God and Jesus out of your own poetry and so on. So tell us where we've gone wrong in taking that approach.
The obvious place where it doesn't work is that if you're anywhere near the Areopagus, if you look just across the little valley, you've got the Acropolis with the Parthenon and the Temple of Nike and lots of other shrines around the place. And Paul says, the Almighty doesn't live in houses made with hands. In other words, your great works of art and architecture are a category mistake. Now, this is hardly playing nice with the local culture, and that's the real crunch of the speech, so that I think apologists who have wanted to say, we must find the altar to the unknown God in our culture, fine, okay, do it, but don't expect that there isn't going to be confrontation 2 or 3 sentences later, where the great religious and cultural symbols of Athens, Paul says, they're a waste of space. You shouldn't have been bothering with that stuff. At that point, he's exactly like, say, Isaiah in chapter 40 or chapter 44, where you get this wonderful, delightful denunciation of all these gods made with hands and fancy temples and people trundling about moving their gods this way and that. Paul is right up there with the Judean critique of pagan idolatry. This is not the way to make friends and influence people. Though that doesn't actually seem to have been, I think I say this, doesn't seem to have been high on the list of Paul's priorities.
No. I mean, as your whole book brings out, Paul is constantly getting in trouble with people and seems to sometimes be his own worst enemy on that front, wanting to kind of address the rioting crowd wherever possible and that sort of thing. Let me just read out a little bit, though. This is from the NRSV of Paul's speech there. He says, "From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God, and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring." So this is the bit in the speech that people often say, well, look, this is Paul using their own poets and sayings to reach them. And I've drawn comfort myself from the fact that he talks about the idea that you're groping around for God and God is not as far from you as you think. And I've tried to use that myself sometimes in sort of, apologetics talks to say, well, look, perhaps people aren't as far as you think they are from God. The things that they are interested in, if they keep tugging at them, there is a kind of God instinct there. Their love for justice finds its home in God. The beauty they see in art finds its home in God. The love they have for their family. These people aren't sometimes as far as they may appear to be from God. And is that a valid kind of inference to draw from Paul's
Of course
speech?
it is. Indeed, you sounded as though you were tracking exactly with my book, Simply Christian, where I start with justice, beauty, relationships, and so on. And then in another book, Broken Signposts, I do 7: justice, beauty, relationships, freedom, truth, power. I've missed one out. But you see the point, that yes, these are all things which people yearn for and long for, and deep down feel this actually makes sense of life, and if you squash it, something valuable is gone. And the question then is, are they all straightforward pathways to God? And the answer is, well, if you try to follow that way, you run into trouble, because we live in a world where justice is denied, where love, however fine it is, ends at somebody's graveside, etc., etc., etc. And so that's where I have argued, and I don't know whether Paul would have done this or not, but that when we tell the story of Jesus, we see God himself coming to the place where justice is denied, where love is trampled upon, where freedom is squelched, etc., etc. So in other words, these aren't pathways up to God, they are signposts to the place where God came down into our broken world. Now, I think that's a very powerful argument myself, and it chimes with the penultimate chapter in my Gifford lectures from a few years ago. But so, I mean, I totally agree. Of course, Paul is quoting there from Aratus, and he quotes from, or alludes to, various other poets, as well as the author to the unknown God. So it's not a you're all wrong on everything, now shut up and let me tell you my story, nor is it you're 3/4 of the way there, let me just top you up. Life is much more interesting than either of those oversimplifications, as I know you know. So yes, if I was, indeed, I think some years ago, I had to do an address, to my surprise, on God in public at the London School of Economics, which is, one of the great sort of high temples of contemporary secular atheism. And I actually went through some of the Areopagus address kind of material, and I did have a sense that I was tracking with Paul, talking to them there. That is, I think, that address is in my book, God in Public, now, though it's a while since I've looked back at it. So I want to say, once we understand the historical context, then, of course, there are things which bubble up and say, yes, we can do this. We can take a line, whether it's from Shakespeare or Euripides or whoever, and say, there's a real human insight there. Let's follow it through and see what might happen. But we must put it into, eventually, a larger framework, because that idea of the God who made from one stock, there isn't actually a word for stock there, the God who made from one, and some Greek manuscripts have tried to add words there to make sense of it, but the God who made out of one all nations, all races, that itself is a message which is so badly needed at the moment. As you probably know, that was a text greatly favoured by the abolitionists in the 19th century who wanted to abolish slavery, fighting against the then very popular racial theories, which went on being popular, sadly, even with Christians, well into the 20th century, that actually the races had developed quite differently, and so it is quite appropriate that we should have these different roles. No, Acts 17 says not only there is one creator God, but there is one common humanity, and now let's work at that. And it seems to me that that is still a message worth preaching, and a message which will resonate with people, a message which will make people say, oh yeah, I actually thought Christianity was a bit racist, but if that's what it says, then it's clear that Christianity is out in the front, paving the way for what we now think of in terms of a genuine multicultural or multi-ethnic society, or whatever, difficult though it is. Now, I could go on at length, but you hear what I'm saying.
Let me turn to another aspect of this that you bring up in the book, this speech from Acts 17. Obviously, it comes in the context of Paul having walked through Athens and been greatly offended by the idolatry there as a, good God-fearing Jew. But he obviously speaks about the idolatry, the many gods, and he points to this unknown God. You make the point that actually we may think, oh, well, that was for then. We don't believe in gods and idols any longer. But you make the point, actually, there are at least three idols of that era that essentially still exist today. The gods of Mammon, Aphrodite, and Mars. Do you want to just explain what they are and how you see those ancient gods still very much surfacing today?
Yeah. I mean, if somebody is discussing a project, starting a business, or how's the family going to turn this corner, whatever, then if somebody says, the financial forces here will be against us, or, well, granted, how the money is going to work, or whatever, there's often an implicit appeal to a force which is greater than the sum total of all the human beings involved. It's as though we now know that you have to do what the money says. Or if ultimately, if one person does something the other person doesn't like, then sooner or later a fist will land on their nose. And of course, if one country attacks another, then the natural response is to attack back, to fight back. And this is a very serious problem, because what do you say if you're in Poland when the Nazis invade, or if you're in Ukraine when Putin invades, or whatever? But the message of the Sermon on the Mount is pretty striking about that violence is not the answer. Now, how we work that out is a very tricky question, but so much of the modern world has seen military power and action as the ultimate thing that we've got to do, that we've got to be ready to do, and we kind of worship that. And then, of course, sex, Aphrodite, the goddess of erotic love. If somebody is overpowered by sexual desire for somebody else, or whatever it may be, then sooner or later a great swathe of our culture says, oh, well, that's obviously what they've got to do. You can't resist that, or it's unhealthy to resist that. It'll mess you up psychologically if you don't give in to those impulses. And so in lots of different ways, Mars, Mammon and Aphrodite are still very much alive and well. And if we simply think in terms of the temptation to greed, or the temptation to anger, or the temptation to sexual immorality, then that's just a temptation which I may have to deal with, or manage to resist. But if we think of them in terms of our society as a whole are worshipping these apparent divinities, so that it becomes very difficult, we're swimming upstream if we want to say no to them. So in other words, temptation isn't simply about me having a thought which I wish I could reject or deal with. It's about being part of what we might call fields of force. And we use the language of force or powers or whatever in a very vague way, like they did in the first century. But I think we all sort of know, and if we don't, then a glance back at the 20th century should remind us that there are all sorts of forces which become superhuman. I mean, the classic example is, of course, Germany in the 1930s, though in a way it's too easy to go to that one, where the evil that was unleashed in the world was far greater than the sum total of all the evil intentions of all the actors involved. There was a much larger thing going on. And in our present world, alas, that's very much so, whether in the financial world or the world of sexual politics or the world of war and violence.
So these modern incarnations, if you like, of Mammon, the idol of money, Aphrodite, the idol of love, often sort of expressed in the culture's, the fact that we're completely swimming, for instance, in pornography and, everything being so sexualized and so on. I mean, what is the Act 17 response to that? Because there is that sort of, it is possible to go off in a very sort of pious direction, I suppose, as Christians, and say we need to reject all this and sort of stand against the immorality of the world and everything else. But what's Paul's response to the idols then, and what would his response be now?
That's a good question. I mean, in Act 17, because it's such a short speech, all that we get is actually the God who made the world is calling it to account and is going to do so through the Jesus whom he raised from the dead. End of speech. Some laugh, some say, we'll hear you again, and off he goes. He escapes any judgment, any condemnation. But in a way, this is where Athens and Corinth join up. People sometimes say, oh, well, Paul tried the natural theology thing in Athens. It didn't work, so he went and talked about the cross in Corinth, and that worked instead. I don't think it's like that at all. I think what we see in Corinth, which then comes out in 1 Corinthians particularly, is Paul actually facing on the ground questions of riches and poverty, questions of sexual behavior, etc., etc. And he's actually dealing with these things as problems within the church, which have to be worked through baptism, through faith, through moral teaching, through example, through learning what it means to be in Christ, so that you can sort of insert that back into the end of the Areopagus speech and say, how is God judging the world? In and through the man he's appointed. Well, who is this? It's Jesus, Israel's Messiah. And if you become part of his family, part of him, if his spirit comes to dwell in you, then you will find fresh priorities. You will find strength to your own surprise to resist the temptation, 1 Corinthians 10, etc. Now, there's all sorts of other things to say about 1 Corinthians as well. Maybe we'll get to that. But I think that's how Paul would see it, that it's part of a package deal. It's not just, we've got 3 or 4 moral rules you're supposed to keep, now try hard. No, for Paul that wouldn't be good enough. He needs the full Trinitarian thing of God the Creator, Jesus the Lord, in whose family we are incorporated by baptism and faith, and the power of the Holy Spirit. Together, they will overthrow the idols. That's a bold claim, but I think that's what Paul would say.
Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by Cadillac. Cadillac certified service technicians are factory trained to fit your vehicle with the tires specifically developed for it. And with our tire price match guarantee, you get the best fit for the best deal. Let us do the work. Available on select eligible tire brands at participating dealers only. Offer ends 12/31/2025. Terms apply. See dealer for complete details. Visit Cadillac.com/service to learn more.
What makes a great pair of glasses? At Warby Parker, it's all the invisible extras without the extra cost. Their designer quality frames start at $95, including prescription lenses, plus scratch-resistant, smudge-resistant, and anti-reflective coatings, and UV protection, and free adjustments for life. To find your next pair of glasses, sunglasses, or contact lenses, or to find the Warby Parker store nearest you, head over to warbyparker.com. That's warbyparker.com.
And as you make clear in this chapter as well, Paul, as you put it, outflanks the philosophers. Now, it may not be immediately apparent on the surface exactly what he's responding to, but you say he very clearly has in mind the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Platonists, those in the school of Plato. So these may be categories that most people aren't very familiar with. Interestingly, I have noticed a real uptick in interest in Stoicism, interestingly, in the last several years. A lot of sort of wellness influencers online, gurus, sort of kind of going to this kind of, this ancient wisdom, as they would call it, for sort of helping people through mental health crises and things like that. And I don't know if you remember this, Tom, but years ago I invited you, it didn't work out in the end, but I invited you to come on a discussion with the illusionist Derren Brown. And he at the time had written a book on happiness. And essentially, it was his guide to Stoicism. He was saying, look, the best way to be happy is to sort of live above the fray and sort of just have this very sort of idea that what will be, and all I can control is my own response to anything. This very Stoic philosophy about sort of just accepting the world is what it is, and you can only be in control of what you can be in control of. And we had a little interchange about that. It didn't turn into a discussion in the end, but it's interesting that these things come around again, though, isn't it? And what just describe what that is, if you would, and what Paul's response is to these different philosophical approaches.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the two great alternatives, the Epicureans and the Stoics, were the ones who were at loggerheads. And, we know people like Seneca being a Stoic, although he was ready to borrow from various Epicurean philosophers if it suited his argument. He, rather like Christians might say all truth is God's truth, he might say, well, all truth ultimately belongs to us, so we'll grab it from you. But those are the two great alternatives. Epicureanism was a minority thing in the ancient world. You had to be quite rich, well off, etc., to be a serious Epicurean, because you had to be able to be detached from the humdrum world, almost visibly living up on the side of a mountain surrounded by your vineyards and with nice slaves to look after you, etc. Because the whole idea was the only thing that matters is pleasure, not lavish, over-the-top pleasure, because that quickly palls and it's not real pleasure, just rather this cool, detached pleasure. Whereas the Stoic says, no, we are part of this whole continuum of the way the world is, and you just have to recognize that that's how it is. And if you don't like it, by the way, the door is open, you're free to leave. That's what Epictetus, one of the great Stoics, roughly contemporary with Paul, says. I love old Epictetus because actually he's quite devout in his way. Even though he's a pantheist, he wants to pray to this God who is all around, and sometimes his prayers are really quite moving. But the point would be this: today in our world, we are still living within Epicureanism, which was the 18th century Enlightenment's vision of people like Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, and so on, where ultimately in Epicureanism, the gods, if they exist at all, are a long way away. They're not concerned with us, nor we with them. So just get on and enjoy life, and they'll do their own thing in their own way. And by the way, when you die so that there's nothing left. So there's nothing to worry about, which is an interestingly ambiguous phrase, as in, there was a book by Julian Barnes about death called Nothing to be Afraid of, which was deliberately two-edged.
And this is exactly the point Derren Brown makes in his book, which is, as I say, inspired by, it's essentially that, well, you didn't exist before and you won't exist in a little while. What's there to worry about, basically?
That's Epicureanism, not Stoicism.
Okay, fair enough.
Because in Stoicism, but the thing is, Stoicism was the default position in the ancient world for many ordinary people at the street level. Epicureanism is the default position for many in the modern world. I found when I say that in lectures, the students immediately grab their pens and start to write, because it's quite a helpful way of looking at things. That we assume if there is a god or gods, they're a long way away, they don't get involved with us, nor we with them. Whereas the Stoics, there is divinity all around, but the problem with Stoicism is there is no critique of evil. For the Epicurean, it's just, well, because everything was random, so why should you expect it to work out nicely? For the Stoic, it was, well, you may not like it, but it is just the way that the world is going, and it's all predetermined, and one day it will all collapse into fire, which will purify it, and then it'll all happen again and again and again. I don't find that a very comforting idea, but that is.
But it's curious because both of those things you've sketched out, I see happening in modern philosophies.
Absolutely. Well, as they were in the ancient world, because you can see that there is evidence of a sort which pushes you in one way and evidence of a sort that pushes you in the other way. And then the Platonists come through the middle, and there are different schools of Platonism, but the sort that Paul may have known would have been more, well, there isn't really evidence to decide one way or the other, so the main thing to do is to keep the old religion going and hope that one day our spirits will arrive where they really belong, because they came from the heavenly world and they want to go back to the heavenly world. And then Middle Platonism, which is contemporary with Paul, people like Philo and Plutarch, they say that quite explicitly. Plutarch is very clear. We have souls that came from heaven. They're looking forward to going back there when we die. Now, when I first read Plutarch saying that, I thought, that's funny. That's what most of the Christians I know think Christianity is. And then it isn't. That's Platonism. But what we see in Paul in the Areopagus address is that he says over against the Epicureans that God is not far from every one of us and he wants to enter into a relationship with us. That's really not what the Epicureans thought at all. But he says to the Stoics that God made the world. He is not identical with the world. He is not simply the divine force within the world. He is over against the world as well as active within it, and he is calling the world to account rather than just letting the Logos do its own thing on and on and on. And to the Platonist, somebody like Cicero, who would ultimately be a kind of academic, which was the earlier form of Platonism, who says there isn't really enough evidence. Paul says, well, okay, there were times of ignorance before. You talked about the unknown God. Well, of course you were ignorant before, but now the God who made the world has done something new and has revealed the way things really are, and he's calling the world to account. So Paul is saying yes and no to the Epicureans, yes and no to the Stoics, yes and no, and now what to the academics or the Platonists of his day. He doesn't expound a Christian worldview over against the Plutarch-type view. That's coming in later in his letters and so on, but I think that's there as well. In other words, don't think that you have a soul which is going to leave this world and go to heaven. The whole point about resurrection is God recreating the heaven plus earth world, not taking us away from earth to go to heaven.
Yeah, and I suppose the takeaway for the apologists today is let's, I suppose, be unashamed of the fact that what we are dealing with in Christianity is something very different to these philosophies. It has Jesus right at the center, and you can't sort of. There's a point of, I suppose, there are points of contact inevitably, but ultimately you're calling people to see things through a very different lens in the end.
Of course, and that's exciting because so many people, if they think about Christian faith, they just think about people saying a prayer and going to heaven and trying to behave themselves. End of conversation. The thought that Christianity from the beginning had a very robust worldview rooted in the ancient Judean world and in ancient Israel scriptures, very deeply rooted and bursting forth into new flower with Jesus, so that it isn't just this trivial thing that people think when they see people going into church on a Sunday morning or whatever, oh, they're just going to say a prayer because they don't feel too good about their lives or whatever. Well, maybe there are some people like that, but Christianity as a whole is much more robust than that and has a particular shape and meaning and can debate with the great philosophical schools without feeling ashamed, because we're looking at the same data, but we're looking at all the data, including the Judean, ancient Israelite traditions, which many philosophers in the ancient world and in the modern simply don't want to know about. It would be a bit disturbing if they did.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I remember when I put to you the fact that Richard Dawkins once sort of poo-pooed the resurrection as, oh, it's just some silly myth that happened in, a backwater of the Roman Empire. And gosh, if God does exist, surely he wouldn't be interested in something as trivial as, raising a dead man. And I remember you saying, well, Richard Dawkins has obviously never been to Jerusalem and has just experienced just what a sort of epicenter it is of all things political, cultural, religious.
Absolutely.
This is, but anyway, There was one passage which struck me particularly just in this chapter on Acts 17, because it does speak to some of the interests and concerns, I suppose, that have come out of my own sort of thinking on this surprising rebirth of belief in God, this new interest in Christianity, but which goes off in different directions, some of it arguably in more sort of politicized directions, people who perhaps want to hold on to some, vision of Christendom from the past, but don't necessarily want all that entails. You said here in this passage, but within postmodernism, the rhetoric of Wright has abandoned those roots and degenerated into the shrill, brittle certainties of different special interests and newly constructed identities. With that, truth itself deconstructs into my truth and your truth, and woe betide anyone, a lawyer say, trying to work out what really happened. And public discourse deconstructs into a new kind of left and a new kind of right, with many Christians feeling themselves bullied into agreeing with the right because they are told that the new left is anti-Christian. This is a recipe not only for confusion, but for danger. I wonder if you would just comment on that, because I suppose I'm seeing some interesting drifts and trends here where there is a sort of a part of the culture that wants to sort of grab onto quote unquote Christian values to sort of as a bulwark, if you like, against what they see as this woke, progressive, left-wing sort of stuff where, everyone has their own truth and that becomes sort of set out in these identity politics. But equally, I know I'm also got my concerns that you're perhaps using Christianity as a sort of for a political purpose more than what it's actually there for.
With the Enlightenment's settlement in America and France, particularly creating their constitutions in the late 18th century, there was this sense that because we were now the enlightened ones, then this new method called democracy is bound to produce the best of all possible worlds. So we assume that we're actually electing some kind of messiah and we're supposed to agree with them all down the line. To which I respond, as a Brit, we've never thought like that. We've never actually idolized our monarchy that much. We have a bit with Victoria and Elizabeth, but actually the monarchy sort of does its job, the constitutional thing, which involves a separation of powers, which we find quite helpful. And then when we elect politicians, we tend to be looking for the least bad rather than for the messiah figure. And I think that's much healthier. And I'm not saying that just because I'm British. I'm saying it because I've lived through many British elections, and I've watched the American elections particularly get more and more and more polarized exactly in the ways that you've described. And I grieve over that because it seems to me that is not the path of wisdom. And it's not how to make proper decisions about the very complex issues facing a society, and particularly when it's a society as big and powerful as America, facing the whole world. Because what happens in America will inevitably affect the whole of the rest of the world. And it's really important we have wise, careful, well thought out, well advised people running things, even if we disagree quite sharply with some of their policies. So, I think I'm basically agreeing with you.
Yeah, I was going to say, just as we start to land this whole conversation then, Tom, I suppose, where does this leave us? As I say, I hold out this hope that we are seeing a revived interest in Christianity as we've sort of seen, at least to some extent, the sort of failed promises of materialism and new atheism start to kind of wane. I think it has opened up a space for people to sort of have that renewed interest. But as I say, it can go off in all these different directions we've just been talking about. What does the book of Acts then, and perhaps specifically Paul's witness there, tell us about how we engage a culture that is in some respects interested and open, in other respects very hostile sometimes to Christian faith? How do we wisely do this in the way perhaps Paul modelled?
Again and again, we see Paul navigating this politically and socially and up front. I love the way in Acts where Paul actually reminds rulers and magistrates what their job is. The scene at the end of chapter 16 where he's been in jail and there's been an earthquake and the walls have fallen down and the magistrates say, tell those men to get out of town. And Paul says, Roman citizens, beaten without trial, imprisoned without charge, sounds like a public apology, and he gets it. And I imagine Timothy and Silas saying, for goodness sake, Paul, let's just leave town. And Paul says, no, I know where the ground on which we stand, and we are Roman citizens. They shouldn't have done this. And the magistrates totally agree with him. They're scared stiff. If word gets back to Rome, they'll be in deep trouble. And Paul is never afraid to pull that stunt. And we can see that Paul respects local magistrates and authorities, and he respects them enough to remind them what their job is. He does the same with the high priest in chapter 23. And that isn't a philosophical navigation so much as a political one, but really a political social one is really very, very important. Because the philosophical underpinnings of that are the Jewish idea that God, the Creator, made humans in his own image because he wants his world to be run properly by wise human beings. You and I have talked before about the book which I wrote with Mike Bird on Jesus and the Powers. It's all in there. And so the Christian's approach must be to reaffirm the goodness of there being wise human authorities, but to remind them what their job is. And that's, of course, where you engage in the philosophical and cultural debates about, let me remind you, dear wise ruler to be, that actually these things mean this and those things mean that, and we've got to be upfront about this and not just drift with whichever loud voices there may be around in our culture at any one time.
Thank you so much for opening up the book of Acts, especially for me, that as I say, that chapter, especially on Paul's speech on the Areopagus is worth the price of the book alone. But it's an excellent overview of the whole thing, and as ever, you make it so accessible, Tom. So the Challenge of Acts is available. I'll make sure there's a link from this show and where you can find out more of Tom's writing in general. But for now, thank you so much for spending a little time talking to me about Acts and how it relates to the modern world, Tom.
Very good to see you again, and I hope it won't be too long before we meet up again. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you for listening to today's edition of the Surprising Rebirth podcast. I just love any chance to catch up with Tom, and as you'll hear shortly, there's another chance for you to do so next time. But the link to N.T. Wright's new book, The Challenge of Acts, is with the show notes. Do feel free also to email your thoughts about our conversation to feedback@think.faith. In fact, Crispian got in touch that way to say, thanks for your work with the Surprising Rebirth series, Justin. I found myself nodding my head along to so many of these episodes, and I'm so grateful for the way this podcast cuts through the cultural muck. You're pulling on some serious threads here. I wanted to share another observation, a significant one. I've noticed in our youth programs in the past few years, young people are wanting to read the Bible again. Kids these days are constantly seeing or hearing hundreds of different ideas from their mates, peers, teachers, social media, family about faith, life, etc. And frankly, they're a bit over it. They're sick of hearing people's ideas about God. They want to read it for themselves. I've been involved with kids and youth programs for nearly a decade now, and this is probably the single biggest change I've seen in young people coming through. They just want to go back to the source, the Bible. Hope that's interesting to you. Best, Crispian. It is very interesting and something I've sort of noticed myself, Crispian, actually, working myself with young people and speaking to other youth workers. There is a desire to go back to the Bible. And I think it's why we're seeing this spike in international Bible sales, apparently being driven by Gen Z. Who would have thought that? But there you are. That's what they're telling us in the publishing industry. Thank you very much for getting in touch again. You can get in touch the same way that Crispian did, feedback@think.faith. And thanks also to Gregor, who left a rating and a review over on Spotify about our live audience AI show with Professor John Wyatt. He said it was a tremendous episode, one of the very best discussions on AI and its implications I have ever heard. It deserves wide circulation. Well, do go back and listen yourself to that episode 11 from this season if you haven't yet. And if you enjoyed it, as Gregor did, then why not follow his lead and share the Surprising Rebirth podcast with others on your social media, or post a rating and a review on your podcast provider. That all helps other people to discover this show. It's also been great to see, just recently, Surprising Rebirth featured in some national press as well. David Brooks gave the book a shout out in his New York Times column recently, and here in the UK, the Radio Times, something of an iconic publication, featured the Surprising Rebirth podcast as one of its picks for those wanting to find out more about whether the UK is experiencing a Christian revival. And I recently published a piece myself in the Times newspaper in its Credo column titled Why Christianity's Quiet Revival is Led by Gen Z Men. I began that article sharing my thoughts on how the popularity of James Partridge's Primary School Bangers set at the Glastonbury Festival this year, in which, armed only with a piano on stage, he gets a whole field of 20 to 40-somethings singing along to classic school hymns, whether that could be yet another sign of the openness to faith that's blossoming in the culture. And I also talk about that Bible Society UK research on the quiet revival and why I believe the meaning crisis is behind this return of Gen Z to church. So anyway, if you're able to look at any of those, do follow me on social media, get subscribed to the newsletter. I usually post links to all of these sorts of things as they appear. And just finally, if you can support this show, it does make a huge difference to my little production company, Think Faith, being able to make this podcast as well as bring you more shows. We've got an exciting one in the pipeline, and it means I can write articles for national newspapers occasionally. As one commenter put it when they saw my recent article in the Times, that's where Christians need to be in the mainstream. And of course, when you support, you get perks as well. Silver supporters get early access and bonus content. Gold supporters get all of that, plus signed books from me and the chance for a monthly catch-up too. In fact, you can support a couple of different ways via Patreon, or there's an option for tax-deductible giving from the USA that gets you the same perks. That's if you want to give regularly. There's also a one-off option for giving via PayPal if you'd like to do that instead. And just a reminder, exclusive to supporters this month, we're releasing my full conversation with biblical scholar Nijay Gupta on his excellent book, Strange Religion, How the First Christians Were Weird, Dangerous, and Compelling. Again, that full conversation with Nijay available exclusively to supporters as bonus content this month. Again, the links to support are with today's show. Coming up next time. This brings us to something that happened a little while ago, but J.D. Vance got into something of a Twitter spat, or X-spat, with a well-known podcaster here, Rory Stewart. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that and what it tells us about the different ways in which we end up using Scripture from our different political vantage points as well.
Yeah, I'll let you take that first.
Far be it from me to comment on American politics, particularly at this moment.
N.T. Wright returns, because earlier this year I hosted a public conversation between Tom and the so-called Bishop of social media, Robert Barron, one of the most influential Catholic leaders in the world. Hear what they had to say to over 1,000 in attendance in a conversation on the evangelization of the West. But as ever, you can access that conversation right now when you become a silver or gold monthly supporter, plus that bonus conversation with Nijay Gupta, now available exclusively to monthly supporters. Again, the link to support is with the show notes. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and the Jerusalem Trust, editing by Isaac Simmons. Thanks for being with me. See you next time.
As a sports fan, I have to confess, sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
This episode is brought to you by Lifelock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Don't be left in the dark. Find out about our latest shows, upcoming events, and recent articles by subscribing to my Think Faith newsletter. It'll arrive once a fortnight, and I'll even send you the first chapters of both my books, Why I'm Still a Christian and The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, for free when you sign up. And if you want to support this show, you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content when you become a silver supporter. Gold level supporters also get signed copies of both those books and the chance for a monthly catch-up with me. Your support makes a huge difference. The links for the newsletter or to support are with the show info, or go to justinbrierley.com.